If your cucumber plants were covered with flowers a few weeks ago and now suddenly seem to have given up, you're probably making the same mistake that thousands of gardeners make every summer without realizing it. One day, you're picking cucumbers every morning and feeling proud of how healthy everything looks. Then the heat arrives and almost overnight the vines stop producing. The leaves are still green. The plants are still alive. But the cucumbers seem to disappear. Most people see this happen and immediately start adding more fertilizer or watering even more. The problem is that those actions often make things worse instead of better. I learned this lesson many years ago after losing what should have been my best cucumber harvest. Everything looked perfect from a distance. Strong vines, healthy leaves, plenty of flowers. Yet week after week the harvest kept getting smaller. I thought insects were the problem. Then I blamed the weather. Then I blamed the seeds. The truth turned out to be much simpler, and it completely changed the way I grow cucumbers today. What surprises many gardeners is that cucumber plants rarely stop producing for no reason. They are usually sending you a warning long before the harvest slows down. The trouble is that most people never notice the signs until production has already dropped. By that point, they start throwing different products at the problem and hoping something works. I see this every summer when neighbors tell me their cucumber plants are finished even though the season is far from over. In many cases, the plants are not finished at all. They are simply stressed and responding the only way they know how. The good news is that this can often be fixed much faster than people think. Sometimes the change begins within days once you understand what the plant is trying to tell you. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the exact reasons cucumber plants suddenly stop producing during the hottest part of summer, and I'll show you the simple methods I use to get them growing again without spending extra money on expensive products. One of these methods was shown to me by an older gardener many years ago, and even today, very few people use it. And before we get to that simple trick, there is one mistake almost everyone makes first that quietly shuts down cucumber production faster than anything else. Now let's talk about what is really happening when those cucumber plants suddenly slow down, because this is the point where most gardeners accidentally create an even bigger problem. When production drops, the first reaction is usually to give the plants more water every day. It sounds logical. Summer is hot. The plants must be thirsty. So people grab the hose and start watering morning and evening. I used to do exactly the same thing. The trouble is that cucumber plants do not always respond well to constantly wet soil. In fact, many times the roots become stressed because they cannot get enough air. The leaves stay green, so everything appears healthy from the outside, but underground the plant is struggling. Instead of putting energy into new cucumbers, it starts focusing on survival. Then people notice fewer fruits and decide the plants need fertilizer. More fertilizer goes down. The vines grow bigger. The leaves become darker. Everything looks impressive. Yet the harvest keeps shrinking. That is one of the most frustrating situations in gardening because it feels like you're doing everything right and still getting worse results. What many gardeners do not realize is that summer heat changes the way cucumber plants behave. When temperatures stay high day after day, the plant begins protecting itself. Flowers may drop. Tiny cucumbers may stop growing. New fruits may appear misshapen or yellow before they reach full size. The plant is not being stubborn. It is simply reacting to stress. I remember one July when I was convinced my cucumber patch was finished. The vines covered half the garden fence, but I was bringing home fewer cucumbers every week. Then, an older gardener looked at my plants for less than a minute and pointed out something I had completely missed. The soil looked wet on top, but was actually dry several inches down. The roots were getting inconsistent moisture. One day too much, the next day too little. That constant cycle was stressing the plants far more than I realized. Most people make this mistake because they judge the soil by what they see on the surface. Cucumbers don't care much about the top inch of soil. What matters is what is happening deeper where the roots are working every day. And once I corrected that simple problem, something happened that completely changed the harvest and revealed another hidden reason cucumbers stop producing in the middle of summer. Dot. This is where things started making sense to me, because once I fixed the watering issue, I expected the cucumbers to come back immediately. Instead, I saw only a small improvement. The plants looked a little happier, but production was still nowhere near what it had been earlier in the season. That's when I learned something that many gardeners never hear about. During the hottest weeks of summer, cucumber plants can look healthy while quietly shutting down fruit production. The vines keep growing. The leaves stay green. New flowers continue to appear. From a distance, everything seems normal. But when temperatures remain high for too long, the plant begins dropping flowers before they can become cucumbers. Sometimes the flowers dry up and fall. Other times, tiny cucumbers start forming and then stop growing. If you've ever walked through your garden wondering where all the cucumbers went, even though the plants are covered with blooms, this is often the reason. I remember standing in my garden one afternoon looking at dozens of bright yellow flowers and thinking I should be harvesting buckets of cucumbers. Instead, I was lucky to pick 2 or 3 every few days. It made no sense until an older gardener explained what was happening. He told me that cucumbers love warmth, but they do not love extreme heat. There is a point where the plant starts protecting itself rather than producing fruit. The energy that would normally go into cucumbers gets redirected into simply surviving until conditions improve. Most gardeners never notice this because they focus on the leaves and vines instead of the flowers. Once I started paying attention, I realized many flowers were disappearing without producing anything at all. That old gardener then showed me a simple method that cost almost nothing. He spread a thick layer of straw around the base of every cucumber plant. You could use dried grass clippings or shredded leaves too. The goal was not to feed the plant. The goal was to protect the roots from overheating. Most people focus on air temperature and completely ignore soil temperature. But cucumber roots suffer when the soil becomes too hot. That layer of mulch acts like insulation. It keeps moisture in the ground longer and helps the roots stay cooler during the hottest part of the day. Within a couple of weeks, I noticed more flowers staying on the plants and more small cucumbers developing properly. It wasn't a miracle. It was simply giving the roots a more comfortable environment. But there was another hidden problem that still limits production for many gardeners, and it often starts with something they believe is helping the plants. The next lesson took me much longer to learn because it involved something I thought was helping my cucumbers. Like many gardeners, I believed that whenever a plant slowed down, it needed more food. So every time production dropped, I would add fertilizer. Sometimes I would even add extra because I wanted quick results. The vines responded exactly as you might expect. They exploded with growth. New leaves appeared everywhere. Long green runners stretched across the garden. At first, I felt successful because the plants looked larger than ever. Then, I noticed something strange. The vines were getting bigger, but the harvest was not. In some cases, I was actually picking fewer cucumbers than before. That's when I discovered a mistake that most gardeners never connect to poor production. Too much nitrogen can turn a cucumber plant into a leaf-making machine. The plant becomes busy growing vines and foliage instead of focusing on fruit. Everything looks impressive, but the harvest disappoints. I learned a simple rule from an older gardener many years ago. He told me to stop feeding the leaves and start supporting the fruit. Instead of constantly adding strong fertilizers, he focused on keeping the plant balanced. One method he showed me was surprisingly simple. Every few weeks, he would add a small amount of compost around the base of the plant and water it deeply. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive, just slow, steady nutrition that the plant could use over time. Most people ignore this because it doesn't seem dramatic enough. They want instant results from a bottle. But cucumbers often perform better when they receive consistent support rather than sudden bursts of fertilizer. Another thing he taught me was to remove old yellow leaves from the lower part of the vine. Not many at once, just the tired leaves that were no longer helping the plant. This improved airflow and allowed the plant to direct more energy where it mattered. I was surprised how much healthier the vines looked after this simple step. Within a short time, I started seeing more flowers and more small cucumbers developing along the vines. The garden felt alive again. What really caught my attention was that this approach saved money. I stopped buying extra products and started using materials I already had around the garden. Sometimes the best solution is not adding more. Sometimes it is removing what is slowing the plant down. But even after correcting watering and fertilizer mistakes, there is another reason cucumber plants suddenly stop producing in summer, and this one catches almost everyone by surprise because the problem is often happening right in front of their eyes every single day. The problem I'm about to talk about is one that fooled me for years because I could see it happening every day and still didn't understand what it was costing me. I had healthy cucumber vines, I had flowers, I had good soil, yet production would suddenly slow down in the middle of summer. Then, one morning, I started paying closer attention to the flowers themselves. That's when I noticed something important. Many flowers would open and then simply disappear without ever producing a cucumber. At first, I blamed the weather again. But the real reason was much simpler. There were very few pollinators visiting the garden during the hottest part of the season. Most gardeners think pollination takes care of itself. Sometimes it does. But during periods of extreme heat, bees and other pollinators may become less active, especially during the middle of the day when temperatures are highest. The flowers open, the opportunity passes, and the plant loses another chance to produce fruit. I remember an older gardener telling me that if you want more cucumbers, you have to make your garden a place where pollinators want to stay. He wasn't talking about buying anything expensive. He simply planted flowers around the vegetable garden. Marigolds, zinnias, a few herbs that were allowed to bloom. Nothing complicated. Those flowers attracted bees and other helpful insects throughout the season. Within weeks, I noticed more activity around the cucumber patch than I had seen all summer. More importantly, I started seeing more cucumbers forming behind the flowers. It was a small change with a very noticeable result. Now, here is the part that many people overlook. During periods of extreme heat, pollination can still become unreliable even when pollinators are present. That's why I sometimes use a simple backup method. Early in the morning, I take a small soft paintbrush and gently move pollen between flowers. It takes only a few minutes. Most people never do this because they assume it's too much work. But when production suddenly drops, it can make a surprising difference. I learned this many years ago and still use it when the weather becomes unusually hot. Another benefit is that it costs absolutely nothing. No special products. No complicated equipment, just a few minutes and a little patience. The interesting thing is that once pollination improves, many gardeners assume they have solved the entire problem. In reality, there is still one final issue that can quietly stop cucumber production even when everything else seems to be working perfectly. And this last one may be the easiest fix of all. The final problem that quietly slows cucumber production is so simple that many gardeners never even think about it. The plant becomes exhausted. That's really what it comes down to. By the middle of summer, a cucumber vine may have already spent weeks producing fruit. It has pushed out leaves, flowers, runners, and dozens of cucumbers. If old fruits are left hanging too long, the plant begins to think its job is finished. This is especially common with larger cucumbers that hide under the leaves and go unnoticed for days. I learned this lesson the hard way after finding several oversized cucumbers tucked beneath a vine. They were so large they were practically seed factories. While those fruits continued growing, the plant slowed down production of new ones. It was putting all its energy into finishing what it had already started. Most gardeners do this without realizing it. They wait for cucumbers to become as large as possible before harvesting. The plant responds by reducing the number of new fruits it produces. Once I understood this, everything changed. I started harvesting more often. Instead of checking every few days, I walked through the garden every morning. Small cucumbers that were ready came off the vine immediately. Hidden fruits were removed before they became oversized. The result was surprisingly fast. The plants responded by producing more flowers and more new cucumbers because they sensed that their work was not yet complete. An older gardener explained it to me this way: the more you harvest, the more the plant wants to keep producing. That simple habit became one of the easiest ways to increase production without spending a single dollar. Another thing I noticed was that regular harvesting helped me catch problems earlier. I could spot yellow leaves. I could see insects before they became a major issue. I could check soil moisture and make small adjustments before stress slowed the plants down again. Everything became easier because I was paying attention every day. What surprised me most was how quickly the garden recovered. A few weeks earlier, I had been convinced the season was ending. Now, the vines were covered with new growth and fresh cucumbers were appearing again. The plants had not been dying at all. They had simply been reacting to several small problems that were easy to overlook. And once those problems were corrected, the difference was obvious. The harvest baskets became heavier. The plants looked stronger. The entire garden felt productive again. But the most rewarding part came later when I realized these same simple habits worked year after year and saved me from repeating the same frustrating mistakes every summer. So, if your cucumber plants suddenly stop producing in summer, don't assume the season is over, because in most cases the plants are trying to tell you something rather than giving up completely. Looking back over the years, I've learned that the biggest harvests rarely come from expensive products or complicated techniques. They come from paying attention to a few simple things that many people overlook. Consistent, deep watering instead of constant, shallow watering. Protecting the roots from extreme heat with a layer of mulch. Avoiding the temptation to overload the plants with fertilizer. Making sure flowers are being pollinated, and harvesting regularly so the vines stay focused on producing new fruit. None of these methods are difficult. Most of them cost little or nothing at all. That is one reason I continue using them year after year. They work. I still remember the first season when I put all of these lessons together. Earlier that summer, I had been convinced my cucumber patch was finished. Production had dropped. The vines looked tired. I was already thinking about pulling the plants out and starting over next year. Instead, I made a few simple changes and gave the plants another chance. A few weeks later, I was carrying baskets of cucumbers into the house again. Friends were taking extras home. Jars of pickles filled the shelves. The difference was not a special product or a miracle trick. It was understanding what the plants needed at the moment they were struggling. That's why I always tell gardeners not to panic when production slows down. A cucumber plant can recover surprisingly fast when the real problem is identified. The best part is that once you learn these lessons, they help every year after that. You stop guessing, you stop wasting money, and you start feeling more confident every time you walk through the garden. If there is one thing I hope you remember from this video, it is that a slowdown does not always mean the end of the harvest. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of a better one. And there is another forgotten method that many older gardeners use to extend cucumber production even further into late summer and early fall. Most people never use it anymore, but it can keep vines producing long after neighboring gardens have stopped. That's a story for another day and one that might completely change the way you look at cucumber season.